Hey, I'm Chris F from Make Everything, and today I'm going to be giving you the ultimate guide to metal cutting saws. I'm going to run through everything from horizontal bandsaws, vertical bandsaws, Porta Bands, metal cutting circular saws, metal cutting chop saws, and everything in between. Every price range from entry level at $100 all the way up to pro level in the $6,000 to $7,000 range. I'll tell you which ones you want to start your business and which ones can help you further the work that you're doing with special features and special abilities that make fabricating that much better. Let's get started. All right, so in my shop, I do a ton of metal work, and there is a lot of different specialty tools, especially when it comes to cutting metal, that make that process a lot easier just by having the right stuff. Now, there are a lot of entry-level saws on the market that are kind of labeled as like one and done, do everything saws. So we're gonna start with those and sort of work our way up from the entry-level chopping saws up through the other different models and the different ways that you can spend a little bit more money, but maybe get a lot more tools. So let's head over to the bench. All right, so I've got 3 chopping saws here on the bench, and the one that you may be most familiar with is over here. This is an abrasive cutoff saw. This uses a 14-inch abrasive wheel to cut metal. It's about a 4,000 RPM saw. And funny story about this one in particular, this is a Buffalo power tool saw made in 1985. This was my dad's saw. This was the first metal cutting saw I ever used. I have vivid memories using this when I was in middle school and high school to make art projects. So this is a sentimental saw to me, and I still enjoy using it every once in a while. The other one we've got is this Evolution 10-inch sort of multi-material saw. Now, these have been marketed on and off over the last couple of years as like the one-and-done saw. They have these videos and photos of people cutting 2x4s filled with nails, and it's a little bit of a gimmick. I will say, though, the saw cuts a lot of material, and it's got its uses. And then we've got this 14-inch, larger, more professional-grade Steel Max saw, also commonly referred to as an Evolution saw, which uses a carbide tip blade and will cut materials really well. Let's take a deep dive into each one of these saws and I'll explain the features. All right, so these abrasive saws are really great for cutting a large variety of material. And these are probably what you're most used to seeing at like a big box store like Home Depot. A ton of different brands makes these, and you can cut, steel studs, you can cut tubing, solid, all that stuff. Now, the benefit of a saw like this is because it's got an abrasive wheel, you obviously can use it the same way you'd use an abrasive wheel on an angle grinder. This saw doesn't care if your material is hardened or soft like aluminum. It will generally cut all of it. It doesn't cut aluminum super well because it gums up the wheel, but if you're maybe a blacksmith or you're doing metal work in that way, when you're gonna have hard material, this is probably your best choice. Cutting hardened material with any of the other saws that we're going to talk about today is going to severely impact the life of the blade. And on a saw like this, while it is going to abrade this faster, it's not really going to care, and it's still going to cut through it pretty well. I'm going to make a cut with this so you can see what happens when you make a cut with an abrasive saw. And then we're going to sort of work backwards from here because this is probably the most aggressive saw in my arsenal. And you'll be able to see why I really choose to not use this. And I really try to opt out and use something else whenever possible. So you can see tons of sparks when we cut with a saw like this. Now, this is a major issue from a safety standpoint because those sparks are going to disperse around your shop, and especially if you're working in like a home garage shop and you've got flammables around like gasoline or lacquer or finish, these things are super dangerous. So I really try to use this only when I absolutely have to, and that's why I opt to use some of these carbide tip saws that I'm going to show you now. So moving away from the abrasive saw, you've got these carbide tooth saws. Now, both of these have similar style blades. This one is, this multi-material. Now, the problem with saws like these is that if you cut something out of the realm of these blades, you can pretty much immediately destroy them. For instance, this saw, somebody cut some stainless with, and this blade is totally shot. So I'm not going to be able to show you how this one cuts, but I will say the difference between these two is obviously this one is more geared like a woodworking saw where it's got a slide and you can miter it by just rotating this thing, even though, it does kind of get jammed up over time. Now, if you want to miter with this saw, you actually have to loosen this fence and rotate it, which can be a little disorienting because the saw stays in one place and then you have to rotate your material. So if you bolt this saw down to a bench, sometimes you're going to have material kind of going way out of bounds and it's not really going to work with an outfeed. They both cut the same way. They use a carbide tooth in order to cut away the material, and they make very little, if any, spark. So I'm going to make a cut with this larger saw. Like I said, the blades are the same and the effect's going to be about the same, and you can see the difference in the cut quality and the lack of sparks. Now, these saws are also commonly referred to as cold cutting saws. They're not really a cold saw, but they do leave pretty much an instantly cool and burr-free edge, albeit there can be, like a little bit of sharpness because this cut is so precise. Now, again, if you wanted to miter this, you would actually have to loosen this fence, and then you can miter it in order to cut angles and all that. So again, this uses a carbide blade, and while these things are really great, they're not really universal in terms of what you can do with a single blade. So now if you have a blade like this, which is situated for mild steel, this will cut hundreds and hundreds of pieces of material before this blade is dull. But let's say you're in a pinch and you need to cut a piece of stainless. One cut in a piece of stainless with a blade like this can ruin it, and then this thing is shot. Plus, these blades are expensive. They're between $60 and $100 for a 14-inch blade, so you don't want to go and risk destroying a blade like this cutting material. The other thing about these, since they're cutting at such a high rate of speed, the offcuts like this have a tendency to go flying, especially when you're cutting miters. So if you're looking for a really precise and kind of less violent cut, you're going to want to look to a bandsaw versus one of these. But if you need a saw that's going to cut mild steel, cut it fast and cut it accurately, one of these chopping saws, these will do it. And now I'm going to show you a handheld version of this style cutting saw. So on the topic of carbide toothed cutting saws, this uses a very similar style blade to those chopping saws, but this is a circular saw. Very similar to a circular saw that you've seen people cut wood with, but this is specifically designed to cut metal. There's a chip catch right here, so as the metal chips are developed, they land in a little catch bin to keep them away from kind of the rest of the shop. And these things can be amazing for cutting in the field. This one in particular is battery powered, which is really nice. And it has a built-in brake. So once you're done cutting, this thing shuts off almost immediately. Something to look for on these types of saws is this little feature. There's a lever over here that will manually bring the blade guard up and down. What'll happen on a saw like this is that while you're cutting a piece of plate, sometimes that piece of plate will get wedged underneath here and it'll prevent this blade guard from getting out of your way, which can cause a dangerous binding scenario. So a lot of these metal cutting saws have a little guard release that you can move with your thumb on your left hand in order to get that blade guard out of the way. I'm going to cut a piece of 1/4-inch plate with this, and let me show you how fast this thing deals with material. All right, so I've got this piece of 1/4-inch mild steel, and I'm going to show you how quickly I can deal with it using that saw. Now, this is a little bit small of a piece to clamp, but we'll use it anyway. Now, with a saw like this, you want the blade to actually stick out through the bottom of the material about 1/4 of an inch, so we don't need to go full depth. And I've got a 0 line on this particular one, so I can flip up my blade guard with my thumb and make a cut. So for dealing with cuts in the field, a saw like this is amazing. Now I have a plasma table in the other room, but it's only 4 foot by 4 foot. And because I don't have a forklift on site, when I get large, thick pieces of sheet goods, I usually need to break them down pretty close to my plasma cut part. And something like this can be amazing. I've cut all the way up to 3/4-inch material with saws like this, and they work really well. That being said, they still cut pretty aggressively. The blades can be kind of expensive, and they're really material based. So you're not going to go and cut, say, a piece of stainless or really even aluminum with the same blade, because you're going to want something particularly special so that you're not destroying these fast moving blades. Now, for a lot gentler of a cut, we can move over into bandsaws. But before we do, I'm going to show you kind of the top tier of saws like this, and that's a true traditional cold saw. All right, so here we've got a Hydmech cold saw. Now, this is kind of the first type of cold saw that you would think of in a real professional environment. This truly does cut cold. It is a low RPM, high-speed steel blade that is material specific. And that's very important with these. So basically, if you're cutting 1/8 inch wall square tubing, that's 1 inch by 1 inch, which is what I cut the most, you have a very specific sized and toothed blade for that material. Now, if I want to switch this out and say cut a piece of 3 inch by 3 inch solid material, I would use a completely different toothed blade with a completely different tooth pitch. That's very, very important. These saws are very expensive, but they leave the absolute best finish on your material, and they're going to cut the cleanest with the most precision. These saws also generally use coolant. This one has a flood coolant that floods the blade. I'll get this set up and we'll cut a piece of tubing, and you can see how nice of a job this saw does. Now, this saw has a 2-piece vise on it. Basically, one part holds the material and then the other part holds the cutoff so that there's very little vibration in the saw. This saw is also a 3-phase machine, so it's a little less applicable to a small home shop. Right now it's set for a 90-degree cut, and I'll show you how nice of a job it does. So something else that's really nice about a saw like this is that it can miter in both directions. Now, this one in particular is made to miter 60 degrees in one direction and then 45 degrees in the other. And if you've ever tried to do a project with angle iron, you know how important it is to have that dual mitering feature. Also, you could see just how kind of gentle of a cut that was. It was quiet and it was very, very controlled. There's no pieces flying anywhere. There's no chips flying anywhere. It's very, very clean. And a cold saw doesn't cut a chip like a regular saw. It actually mills a chip like you would have, say, an end mill on a Bridgeport or a milling machine, cutting and removing material in that sort of manner. Now, the drawback of this machine, like I said, is that if I got to switch this out now and cut a solid bar, I've got to have a whole nother blade, and I've got to take, and change out the blade. Also, the blades for these are really expensive. The blade that I just cut with was probably over $200. Now, the blades are made to be sharpened, so if you do wind up getting 3 or 4 different blades, you're probably only going to buy them once, and then you're going to send them out to get sharpened. But that's a whole nother logistical issue that you have to deal with if you don't have a local sharpening service. This is a 14-inch saw, 350 millimeters, so if you actually do send out blades, it's expensive because they're pretty heavy. That being said, if you're going to be doing repetitive work with tubing or bar, this is like the top tier thing that you can use. It is the most precise. That blade is never going to deflect like a bandsaw will, and it's going to just give you a beautiful, beautiful cut. So now that we're done with the chopping saws with round blades, let's move over to some bandsaws, and I'm going to start by showing you a Porta Band, which is pretty much everybody's go-to saw for their home shop. So now that we've gone through the chopping saws, I'm going to go over to bandsaws. Now, this right here is a Porta Band, or a portable bandsaw set up with a table, and this is probably one of the most common metal cutting saws that you're going to find in a home shop. These things are amazing. This one is a cheap, like $120 one from Harbor Freight that I modified into a little table, and I use this thing and continue to use it for years, making all sorts of different things, cutting hardened knife steel, titanium, you name it, I've cut it with this. There are a lot of different variations of Porta Bands, and then there are some smaller chopping bandsaws that are a little more affordable, but we'll start with this one. So again, this is a portable bandsaw. It was not designed to go in this stand, but it works really well in this application. Basically, all I did here was take a piece of aluminum plate and I drilled some holes in the bottom, and I was able to bolt it to the actual cutting plate on this saw. This is a Harbor Freight saw. I don't think they make this exact model anymore, but they make similar ones to it. And I'm going to show you how it cuts a piece of little 1x1 tubing. Now, for a knife maker or a small metal shop, this thing is perfect. You can cut flat plate with this. I've cut 1/2 inch material with this. And what's really nice about these is that this blade size is extremely common, and they sell Milwaukee blades that will fit all these Portabands at Home Depot in a 2-pack for like $16. The thing about bandsaw blades is that once you wreck a bandsaw blade, you need another one. You're not going to go through and resharpen all these little teeth. So if you buy a larger vertical bandsaw, you're going to have to deal with a much more expensive and harder to find blade. These things will get chipped up, they'll get destroyed, but you don't want to have to worry about being out of stock of these blades if you're using one of these in your shop. So I like a Portaband because the blades are so easy to just go out and buy. On the topic of Portabands, I've got a truly portable setup with this one being a cordless, brushless Milwaukee bandsaw. This thing is multi-speed, and I've used this on a million jobs, and I actually find myself reaching for this bandsaw or this much smaller Bosch portable bandsaw more than anything in the shop, because instead of me having to take material down off my rack, I can just, climb up on the bench, cut my material down to a rough length using a little one-handed saw like this, and then bring the material down, cut it to size on the bigger saws. This is what that Portaband I just showed you would traditionally look like out of the box, and all I did, like I said, was stand it up, put a plate on it, and go to town. A company called Swag Offroad makes some tables for these saws, and I'm going to throw some links to those down in the description. But again, the blade on this saw is the same blade that I've got in the one on the bench. So if this one goes bad or breaks, the one on the bench can be swapped out, vice versa. And changing blades on these is super easy. You basically just release a lever and you got to do a little fishing, but the blades pop right out. There's not really any complicated tensioning or complicated lining up that you would have to do on, say, a wooden bandsaw, where you can spend quite some time lining your blades up. You just sort of pop them out, pop them back in, give it a run, it'll line itself up and move forward. On the topic of bandsaws that can be vertical, I'm going to show you a bigger vertical bandsaw that can be a lot harder to get blades for. So this right here is one of my favorite tools. This is a Powermatic Model 143 multi-material bandsaw. This could be used as a wood bandsaw or a metal cutting bandsaw by changing the lever positions in the gearbox on the back of the machine. Right now I have it set up to cut metal. It runs really slow with a lot of torque and does a fantastic job. I don't use this saw very often, and the reason is because these blades are kind of expensive, and when you're cutting material, you don't know if you're going to hit a hard spot, or maybe you're going to cut a bolt and the bolt is a little bit harder than that blade is ready to cut. And once you start chipping these teeth off, it's like a $65 or $70 replacement for this. Now, there are some companies like Starrett that make a really, really high quality blade for a saw like this, but I need a very specific size and I can't just run out to the store and get one if I'm in a pinch. That being said, for cutting fine work, I can get smaller blades that'll cut curves. For cutting thick work, I can get nice thick blades, and it's a way quieter, much more refined cut when I'm using it. I really enjoy using this saw when I have the need for it, but on a day-to-day basis, I find myself going to the Portaband much more often because I don't want to wind up in a position where I break this blade or I blow the teeth off, and then this saw is going to be down and I got to spend another $65 or $70. Now, the vertical bandsaws and the Portabands are great, but if you want to make repetitive and precise cuts, you're going to need a horizontal bandsaw. I've got two in my shop, one very small, kind of home model one, and then the big one behind me, and I'm going to show you the differences between the two of them. So if you've watched my channel before, you've seen this saw a bunch. This is a Wen horizontal chopping bandsaw. So now this uses a trigger, and it is just manually controlled, very similar to the other chopping saws we had earlier in the video. Now mine I had to modify because the blade kept popping off and it was driving me absolutely crazy. But since I did this little kind of washer trick, it's worked pretty well. What's nice about a saw like this is it's got a pretty nice capacity. It's very quiet and controlled. And this saw in particular can miter, I want to say 60 degrees in one direction. Now this saw is a lot more controlled of a cut than one of those chopping saws other than the cold saw. And since it's a bandsaw, you can cut thick, solid material pretty easily and very cleanly because it's going to just slowly remove that material and cut through it. Here's a piece of 1-inch solid bar, and I'll cut it on this saw. So that's a really clean, cold cut, very little burr, and just a nice overall process to cut that. You can also, like you can see here, cut miters on a saw like this. The problem with this saw is that its capacity is so small and the blade just has so much ability to waver that when you start to cut larger pieces of material, especially larger pieces of tube like this, I find that it's not very accurate. It's great for, say, 1x1 tube like this that you can just cut 45s in, but you're going to wind up doing a good amount of grinding. And it's very, very difficult to get a saw like this tuned so it cuts perfectly. That being said, this is only about a $250 saw. The blades are not expensive. You can get them on Amazon, and they're pretty fast to change. So if you're looking for something that's going to give you a horizontal bandsaw on a very small footprint, this is my favorite saw to recommend. All right, so moving up from that little chopping bandsaw, you've got a much larger, much more expensive dual mitering horizontal bandsaw in this Bailey BS350M. Now this is about a $7,000 saw, but its capabilities are incredible in comparison to some of the smaller saws. Now this uses a 1¼ inch thick blade, very, very tall, which is going to keep it much more rigid, and it's going to keep it from wavering in the cut. And this also can miter in both directions. This vise can be slid over, and this saw can spin and miter 60 degrees in one direction and 45 degrees in the other. This is also an automatic horizontal bandsaw. So you may have seen smaller horizontal bandsaws in shops before where you sort of just flip a lever and the saw slowly drops, it cuts through the material, and then it turns off at the bottom. That's essentially what this saw does, while also offering the option to hold the trigger and manually pull the saw through. Now the beauty of a saw like this being a bandsaw, you can cut really large, solid material with efficiency and ease, and it's still going to be extremely accurate. With some of those chopping saws, if you put a 3-inch solid bar in there, it is not going to like ripping all that carbide through that and, you know, cutting that piece. A bandsaw like this is made to remove material, and it's going to be able to cut solid bar really, really efficiently. This is also a coolant fed saw, similar to the cold saw that I showed you before, but at the moment I don't have the coolant feed set up because I'm in the process of changing it out. I'm going to show you a cut with this saw just so you can see what it's capable of doing. So we've got a piece of 2x3 by 1/4 inch wall in there, and this has a hydraulic piston that will lower the saw head. I can adjust the speed in which it falls, making it slower or faster, and I can turn on the saw right here, and I can adjust the speed of the blade using this dial. So you can see at the bottom of the cut, the saw automatically shut off. I can lift the head, lock the piston, and we're ready to make the next cut. Like I said, the big appeal of a saw like this is being able to miter in both directions. So by undoing this lever right here, there's also a safety pin in the back. I can spin this whole saw head in either direction. So if I wanted to miter in the other direction, I can loosen some adjustments on my vise, and I can actually slide my whole vise head over. And then the vise will be out of the way for me to miter to either the left or the right. It's also got a really nice detent for locking in your zero that you can fine tune and locks down. Again, this is a real professional level saw. This thing has a maximum capacity of about 10 inches, and this saw retails for around $7,000 before freight. All right, so that about does it for the variety of saws that you can use in a metal shop. I really just wanted to share with people that there are a ton of different options at many different price points that will help you cut metal efficiently and get you started on your metalworking projects and your metalworking journey in your home shop. Now, I went all the way from the bottom to the top, going from those inexpensive Portabands up to the big bandsaw and the big cold saw. I started with that abrasive cutoff saw in the back. Like I said, my dad let me use that when I was a little kid. He passed it down to me, and I still keep it in the shop. If I was gonna tell somebody what saws to get started with, I would say get yourself a Porta Band and maybe a table kit, and then one of these horizontal chopping bandsaws, because they're really gonna allow you to cut the largest variety of material from solid to tube. And then if you wanna work more efficiently, get yourself one of those cold cutting saws and eventually work your way up to some of these big machines. Portable saws are fantastic if you're gonna run around and do job work, or if you're in a smaller shop and you need to, say, go to a metal supply and cut up material. I utilize all the saws and all the tools that I have in my shop, but I just don't use them every day the same way. I like to have a variety of things, and I've spent a really long time collecting all these tools, and I have bought pretty much all of them secondhand to save money. Now, that being said, I'm not expecting or telling anybody to go out and spend $6,000 or $7,000 on a cold saw or a big bandsaw like this. You can find these tools used. I bought these big saws used, and I got them both for under $2,000, which is a huge savings off of the retail, and there are tons of deals out there. I also want to say I recently relaunched my Patreon, and I'm going to be sharing tool buying deals from around the country on there. Contributions start at $1 a month, and I've been posting pretty much every day different tool deals that I find either at auctions or over on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist. So if you want to check out some cool used tool deals, check me out on Patreon. I really hope you enjoyed this little video. I want to do some more videos in the shop talking about tools. It's something that I'm really passionate about and something I get a ton of questions about through my Instagram. You don't need all this expensive stuff, like I said, to fabricate great projects, but I think it's very important to know what's out there, because if you do want to expand on your business or expand on your personal projects, you need to know what's next around the corner so you can say, hey, I want to do this project, but I want to do it more efficiently. And if you have the awareness of new and different tools, it will just help you have a goal to set that you can say, hey, you know what? I really want to get a cold saw, so I'm going to save up my money or look for one used. I didn't know about half of these tools when I first got started, and now having them all in my shop, it's the first thing I go to when I know I have a specific project. I know exactly what tool I'm going to need to use, and they all help me get things done more efficiently and honestly just have more fun making stuff because I have the right stuff. If you have any comments or any questions, suggestions on other ways to cut metal like I showed, leave them down below. I'm happy to answer them, and I always like when there's a dialogue in the comments of my videos. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos like this and more videos in the shop. And I would love to hear what you guys want to learn about next. I'm thinking about making a video showing how to drill holes in metal because, God, there are a ton of questions about what kind of drill bits, what kind of tools, and what you need to do it. And it's so much easier than I think most people realize. So I'm going to be sharing something about that very soon. Got a lot of great projects coming up. If you want to see what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis here in the shop, follow me right here at Make Everything Shop on Instagram. I post pretty much every day, and I'm always sharing behind the scenes and asking people questions on what they want to see next and interacting with people over there on Instagram. I really hope you enjoyed this. Again, I am Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and I hope to see you on the next one.